Richard Foster says, solitude is the creation of an open, empty space in our lives by purposefully abstaining from interaction with other human beings, so that freed from competing loyalties, we can be found by God. Now, I need to start by giving you a clear distinction. There's a difference between isolation and solitude. Folks, isolation is people running from pain. Solitude is people running into pain. Isolation says, I want to get away from whatever it is causing me problems. Solitude says, I want to step into whatever those issues are, and I want to embrace them before God in a quality of time. You realize that when Jesus went out into the wilderness, he was led into the wilderness by the Holy Spirit to what? Be tempted by the devil, it says. Jesus spent 40 days in solitude. It wasn't isolation. And I have to say that because I know sometimes people, they want to isolate because they can't deal with things. Please don't hear me say, go ahead and do that. Isolation is it's masking the real issues. It's trying to kill pain that will never work. But solitude is taking that same stuff and going before God with it purposefully. Do you hear the difference? I mean, I hope you catch the difference because it's really critical, particularly if you're someone who tends to isolate. Don't sanctify that by calling it solitude. In fact, if you tend to isolate and when you're hurting you just ignore people, you probably need the discipline of fellowship. That's probably the discipline that God is going to meet you in. But if you're the kind of person whose life is so busy that you can't seem to find any time with God, I have to ask, why did you make it so busy? Is there anyone here who thinks that they have more to accomplish in the next 3 years than Jesus did when he was living on earth? I haven't met anyone yet who has more to accomplish, more important things to do than Jesus during the 3 years that the Gospels focus on in his life. And yet you find Jesus in solitude all the time. In fact, you find it so often that the Gospel writer says, there he does it again. You know, he goes to pray again. He goes into the mountains again. It's almost like, in fact, often in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are running around trying to figure out where he is. How is it that someone who has so much to accomplish and yet embraces solitude? Now, I know as I'm pointing fingers at you that I'm pointing them back at me because I overload my life. I get my life so busy that I don't have time for solitude. But let me just postulate that none of us have more important things to do than Jesus did during his 3.5 years, and Jesus made sure that in the midst of all he had to do, that he found time for solitude. Dallas Willard has said that solitude, if Bible study is the primary discipline of engagement, solitude is the primary discipline of abstinence. For those who weren't here last week, engagement is all about things that I go out and do. Abstinence, disciplines of abstinence are what I eliminate from my life. So disciplines of abstinence are things like chastity or giving or fasting. And in this context, solitude. Mark's gospel, in the first 10 chapters, you can find at least 7 or 8 different strategies that Jesus tries to employ to find solitude. I mean, there's a pattern in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus goes to get alone. They come find him. Other people come along. He ministers to them. He finishes his ministering, and then he goes somewhere else to try to get alone. Read it sometimes. The first 10 chapters of Mark, Jesus doesn't go anywhere looking for ministry. I mean, the only ministry he's looking for is the ministry of getting alone with his Father. They come find him. Remember, he goes up on a mountain. He gets up really early in the morning and goes out to a lonely place. He goes down by the lake. He tries that one a second time. Then when he goes down by the lake, they come find him, so he gets in a boat. Then he tries the divide and conquer method. He sends them in a boat, and he goes up on the mountain. Do you know he even, in chapter 7, he leaves the country to get alone? He says that. He says he leaves the country so that no one else will know where he is. Why? Because solitude is foundational. Any of you guys ever practice quiet times? Folks, in its very essence, that's about solitude. In its very essence, that's about solitude. Quiet time. Solitude can be for long times, can be for short times. The genius of the Desert Fathers was that they learned that if they would go out and meet with God, that then when they met with people, they were recognized as people having met with God. Amen. Do you ever meet someone who you just say, man, that guy's been with God? When I find someone who I know has been with God, man, I just want to buddy up next to him. In fact, I want to listen to anything they have to say. I'm wide open for input when I find someone who's clearly been with God. That's the power of solitude, folks. That's the power of getting alone with God. In fact, in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul says that it is our primary first ministry, beholding him, that we might be changed from one glory into another. Okay, let me give you some suggestions on how you can do this. If you have like really, really, really hectic days and hectic households, what about this? 1 hour of solitude a week for the whole family. For 1 hour. I mean, it's not that big, but for 1 hour, everyone has got to be alone. And by the way, no technology. You know, technology is a great distractor. We don't mean alone with your TV set. We don't mean alone with YouTube. You can make decisions whether people can listen to music or not. That's up to you. But 1 hour where everyone is alone. What an incredible idea. What about just taking a walk by yourself every day? Probably wouldn't hurt many of us, huh? Might even be good for us. You know, of about 7 or 8 times when I met with Jesus, most profoundly in my life, I can think of 7 or 8 times that stand out so clearly in my mind. 2 of those times were in a period of my life when I was cleaning a Burger King late at night. I'd get done at 2 in the morning. I was the only one there, and I had a 45-minute walk from the Burger King to my home. I would walk across the college town, and during that walk, there was literally nothing to do but walk. And so I talked to God. It was imposed solitude. Out of the 9 times that I can clearly remember God profoundly touching me, 2 of those times were during those 9 months of solitude walks with God at 2 in the morning. In fact, one of them, I had quit the job, and I went back to the job like 3 months later to help a friend out. He said, Matt, would you clean for me? Sure, I'll do that. And as I was walking down this one particularly dark spot of the road, I just was having this incredible time with God. And I said, man, God, I really miss this time. And it's one of those times I heard so clearly God say, so do I. So do I. Solitude.